Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us for the latest CWS Wildlife Chronicles webinar. We're thrilled to have you join us on India's 74th Republic Day, which is celebrated today. So my name is Simran Prasad, and I'm a doctoral fellow at the Center for Wildlife Studies. The Center for Wildlife Studies is a 38-year-old nonprofit organization with a focus in conservation science, wildlife research, education, and policy. And essentially, we used to conduct the talks that we've been having recently in the latest topics in wildlife research, conservation, education, and policy. But because of COVID, it's given us the opportunity to take our webinars online. So we launched CWS Wildlife Chronicles, and this will be our 43rd webinar. So our past webinars have included discussions on a range of topics, such as zoonotic diseases, species conservation relating to elephants and tigers, to name a few, and research on bioacoustics and human-primate interactions. If you'd like to see our past webinars, you can visit our YouTube channel to view these. And today's webinar will also be recorded and available on our YouTube channel. If you wish to support CWS initiatives and other similar outreach work that we do, you can use this QR code to donate. You can also visit our website at cwsindia.org or get in touch with us. You can also write to us at outreach@cwsindia.org. So let's explore the topic of discussion for today's webinar. So currently, our planet's oceans and seas are facing multiple challenges and threats. One of these threats involve unsustainable fishing practices, which can significantly impact marine biodiversity. Trawling is a fishing method that is often used, and this happens by pulling a fishing net through the water behind one or more boats. This technique can have serious effects on marine species, often resulting in negative effects on diverse marine ecosystems. I'm sure many of us are curious to understand how trawling impacts biodiversity, and I'm delighted to moderate what I'm sure will be an engaging discussion. So it gives me great pleasure to introduce our distinguished panelists. Dr. Rohan Arthur is the founder trustee of Nature Conservation Foundation, NCF. Dr. Arthur currently directs the reef program at NCF and has worked in several reef systems around India and along the Kenyan coast. Dr. Arthur's primary interests include furthering good field ecological research in marine environments in India and in reef community dynamics and disturbance. Dr. Arthur's doctoral research focused on the consequences of temperature-induced mass mortality of coral on the reef systems of the Lakshadweep atoll reefs in Western India. So welcome, Dr. Arthur. Great to have you on the webinar.
Thanks for having me, Simran.
Next on our panel is Professor Geert Hiddink, who is a professor in the School of Ocean Sciences at Bangor University, Wales, and specializes in the field of marine benthic ecology. After completing his PhD at Groningen University in 2002, Dr. Hiddink started a postdoc at Bangor University, where he studied the impact of bottom trawling on the functioning of benthic invertebrate communities. He joined the lecturing staff in 2006 and was promoted to reader in 2013. I was lucky enough to have attended Professor Hiddink's lectures during my undergrad classes at Bangor, which was truly a wonderful learning experience. So a very warm welcome, Professor Hiddink.
Thank you very much.
To complete our distinguished panel, we're delighted to have Dr. Divya Karnad join us. Dr. Karnad is the Assistant Professor of Environmental Studies at Ashoka University with a PhD in Geography from Rutgers University, USA. Prior to joining Ashoka University, Dr. Karnad consulted with the Bay of Bengal Program Intergovernmental Organization and founded In Season Fish, a sustainable seafood initiative. The focus of Dr. Karnad's work is marine conservation, fisheries management, the geography of seafood climate, and aquaculture and common property theory. Delighted to have you on our webinar, Dr. Karnad.
Thank you so much.
So CWS thanks all our esteemed panelists, and the question which I think comes to mind is, what is trawling? So I'd like to open this question up to all of our panelists. Based on your research and experience, could you share with us about what trawling is, where it's practiced, and why it is done? So Dr. Karnad, would you like to go first?
Sure. I think overall, I can only speak about the Indian experience. So I will wait for others to kind of weigh in. But from what I have seen, there are different types of nets and different ways in which trawling operates. But the overall idea is that it's an active form of fishing where a net is dragged behind a boat. And this net could be dragged at different depths and so on to catch pretty much whatever is in its path. And that's what we see in India, but perhaps the others could talk a little bit more.
Sure. Thank you so much, Dr. Karnad. How about you, Dr. Hiddink? What are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, so there are many different types of troll gears that are used. So there are mid-water trolls that target pelagic fish in the water column, like sardines, for example. My specialty is more about bottom trawling, which is where you're targeting fish and invertebrates that are living on the seabed. So we're talking about flatfish. In Northern Europe, where I'm based, there's lots of fishing for species like cod. And in tropical or warm waters, there's lots of targeting of shrimps. But if you're trying to catch fish that live on the sea bottom, or sometimes even buried in the sea bottom, you need to somehow encourage them off the bottom into the net, and that's why these troll gears tend to be towed over the seabed and may have some kind of chains or ground ropes that are designed to disturb the fish or the shrimps and encourage them to go into the net.
Okay, that's very insightful. Thank you, Dr. Hiddink. Dr. Arthur, what are your views on this?
I think both Jan and Divya have given a pretty comprehensive description of what trawling is. Okay? And I mean, the only thing I can potentially say is that historically the trawling is actually fairly ancient. It's been there since around the 15th century or so, and earlier it wasn't done with on boats. It was even done with oxen along in Europe. And of course, when the steam engine came along, you had, that actually changed things completely, because it actually made things much more efficient. It changed the, you have muscular energy of the oxen being converted into the energy generated by coal. And I think that, that transition has made it so efficient. It's an extremely efficient way of fishing. And of course, it can be extremely devastating as well, particularly when, as Jan was talking about, when you have benthic trawling that can be really quite destructive. And of course, the reason that it's so attractive, I think, as a fishery is that it is efficient and indiscriminate, can be fairly indiscriminate. I mean, depending on the size of the mesh you use, the trawl can pick up pretty much everything. And at least in the first few years of a fishery, when trawling is, takes place in an area, it can be very profitable, until, of course, target populations are depleted and the benthic ecosystems are stripped bare, etc. And also say one thing, that I'll preface all this with the caveat that I'm primarily a coral reef scientist, not worked much on coastal fishing, and most of what I know of trawl fishing is through my extensive interactions with my students and colleague Mayuresh Gangal and Aaron Lobo, who know this sector much better. So I'm here actually in their stead. So this entire conversation needs to be, prefaced with that caveat.
Thank you, Dr. Arthur. It's very interesting that it's kind of been there since the 15th century. I think that's really, it's quite interesting to think about how those impacts have kind of translated down. But just staying with you, actually, Dr. Arthur, in your experience, how has trawling changed over the years, and why do you think there have been any changes, if any?
I can, once again, like Divya, I'll speak largely to the Indian experience. Okay, and I think since trawling was introduced into India at around the late 1960s or so, and of course it quickly spread in popularity, encouraged along with a variety of central government schemes. Okay, and since then, I think the primary thing that has changed is that it has increased in its spread. It has increased in the capacity of the gear and in the types of gear that are being used. From the 1960s to the 1980s, it hadn't actually made much of a dent in the sector, in the fisheries sector. It actually contributed still just around 5% of the total catch in India. And it is because, in India, fisheries was still very much largely artisanal and small scale. And Divya can contribute to this perhaps a little bit, and I think that the artisanal and small scale fishery still continues to actually play a fairly important role within fisheries in India. It was, I think, by the mid-90s, much of this has changed, and trawling had started becoming a major force. By the mid-90s, according to the Seas Around Us project, trawl fishing contributes to around 20% of the total catch. Today, it has grown to about 54% of the overall catch in India. And approximately the landings are about 200,000 tons of fish being caught annually from trawl fishing. I think one other big change that has taken place is the growth of the multi-day trawling, which, while single-day trawlers have remained relatively constant, the spread of multi-day trawling has increased dramatically. And this basically allows fishers to fish much, much longer, travel much greater distances. And so because they're spending more than 1 day, they spend 2 or 3 days out in the open ocean in nearshore coastal areas. And that gives them a much longer time to fish. So many of these changes have actually been promoted by the fisheries department that are committed to increasing production. Okay, and as the fish catches are in nearshore waters, are beginning to be depleted, fishers are forced to look further afield and to fish deeper to remain profitable. So that, of course, in order to do that, there's been a whole lot of technological changes as well. Okay, and in terms of the capacities and things like that of the boats, and including the possibility of pairing boats together to increase the fishing capacity. Of course, along the way, trawl fishing, as it has become more and more mechanized and industrialized, the decline in fish catch has also caused a huge amount of conflict with the coastal fishers who are small-scale fishers. And much of that conflict, many of the rules that have happened in the Indian context in terms of regulating the fishery has largely been not to do with ecological principles so much as in relation to managing the conflict between the trawling sector and the small-scale sector. And some of that be able to enlighten us on as well. But yeah, those very broadly as a large arc when it comes to the Indian fishery, those are the kinds of things that have changed as far as I know.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Arthur. I think it's really interesting to even think about in terms of the conflict that you've mentioned, because I think that aspect of it is also, there's so much at play and it's such a dynamic relationship. So that's really interesting. So Dr. Hiddink, I'd also like to talk about, bottom trawling and its impacts. So based on your research, how does bottom trawling affect benthic communities, and are there any long-term effects that we're seeing?
Yeah, so here in Benga, we've done a lot of research on this. So as I described before, these trawl gears are in firm contact with the seabed bottom, and therefore there may be effects on the biodiversity of the seabed. So we're talking here about things like clams and starfish, or corals that may live on the seabed, and lots of worms, for example. And so when you drag a trawl over these kind of habitats, there is going to be damage to these benthic habitats, and a fraction, part of these benthic animals are going to be killed by the trawl. And the amount of the fraction that is going to be killed by the trawl depends strongly on where you fish and what kind of trawl gear you use. So the most widely used trawl gear are otter trawls, and these are probably the ones that are used in India mostly. These have otter doors at the side of the net that keep the net open when it's being towed behind the net. These actually have the smallest effect. So on average, our work has shown that they kill about 6% or so of the fauna when you tow it over the seabed. It obviously depends on what kind of seabed you're looking at. So trawling is mostly done on sand and mud and gravelly seabeds. So there, the 6% is probably quite accurate. If you start trawling in areas where there's much more what we call sessile epifauna, so animals that are attached to the seabed and cannot move, such as, for example, some species of soft corals or anemones, or you may get mussel beds, then the mortality rates are going to be much higher. Then there's other trawl gears that are used quite widely in northwestern Europe, such as beam trawls and scallop dredges. And they have their effect on the bentels is much larger. And the strongest effect of all the mobile towed gears are by hydraulic dredges. So these are dredges that actually resuspend the top layer of the sediment and harvest mostly clams, and they kill about 40% or so of the fauna that lives there. So then the effect of this trawling activity on your benthic ecosystem is going to depend on what trawl gear you use, at what intensity you fish it. So how often is a piece of seabed fished every year, and then how sensitive are the animals where you're fishing them. So as I said before, some of these kind of habitats are actually quite resilient because they are naturally quite muddy, and then the impacts may not be that high, but some areas are fished quite intensely. So for example, in Europe, the most intensely fished areas are probably fished somewhere between 10 and 30 times a year. So every square meter is fished. A trawl goes over it 10 times a year. However, on average, we're looking at slightly less than once a year. So that means that some areas are not fished and some areas are fished once a year or so. I'm not very familiar with fishing in India, but we have written a paper about bottom trawl fishing in Southeast Asia, and I know from these areas that some areas are very heavily trawled, so there may be some bits of the seabed that are fished more than 50 times a year, or maybe up to 100 times a year. So that means that fishing vessels return to exactly the same location, maybe 3 times in a year or so, or 10 times in a year, or many times. So yes, the important message basically that I'm trying to give is that there can be very strong effects in particular locations on particularly vulnerable habitats, and in areas where there's very intense fishing, but in other areas where habitats are not so sensitive, or where fishing is not very intense, the effects may be very limited. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Hiddink. That's, very interesting. I think even like you mentioned, talking about factoring in sensitivity of the animals that are, kind of involved in this whole process, and also the different types of trawling gear is really informative in the context of the scale of how much of an impact it's causing. So thank you very much. Dr. Karnad, I just wanted to talk a bit about the tools and resources that we can use. So what do you think we can kind of use to better understand the complexities of trawling and the impacts that this can have to marine ecosystems?
Okay, so I think one of the most obvious things for us are the conflicts that are happening within the fishing community. To a great extent, they kind of mirror the ecological impacts that are happening in the water, in the sense that trawling has been introduced and it's always been a very different type of fishery from the types of fisheries that were done before, even socially and economically, not just ecologically. Because typically, I think before we would have partnerships or some kind of a share system where people would fish together. Whereas once trawling came in, it became a totally capitalist kind of situation where there was one or a couple of owners, and then there were a bunch of people working for them. And that's sort of been the way that trawling has replicated in India. which has resulted in various types of disconnections between the people who are actually on the trawl and the ocean. So, for example, what we're seeing now is people coming from Bihar and many inland states, Chhattisgarh and so on, working on trawlers. And so they often do not have the kind of ecological knowledge that we would expect people who have been fishing for generations to really have. So to be able to even talk to them about what is happening in the ocean, for them to even understand the impacts of what they're doing is a bit difficult. Then there are also fishermen who may be working on trawls, but unfortunately they may be fishermen from elsewhere. So we have, fishermen from Andhra Pradesh fishing in Gujarat and fishermen from Kerala fishing in Tamil Nadu, and all these kinds of migrations that we see within the fisheries, which are causing various levels of disconnect between the actual fishermen and the ocean. So the result of this is that we're seeing that the people who are doing the fishing often really don't understand what they're doing, what the impacts are of what they're doing, and it's therefore a bit difficult to actually engage with them and really get them to, make any kind of change or make things better. So the complexities that we're seeing in terms of the conflicts within fisheries, I think very much mirror the situation that's happening in the water. So as Rohan was saying, there have been historically several events, if not continuous conflict between the small scale fishery and the trawlers. And as new types of fishing gear have been introduced, these conflicts have just sort of kind of spilled over, and now there are conflicts between various different types of sectors in the fishery. The government has tried to step in and regulate this in various ways. For instance, there is some kind of zoning in different states where a certain area just off the shore is supposedly exclusively for artisanal and small-scale fishers. And the areas beyond that are supposedly open for trawling and so on. But in practice, you don't see any kind of zoning or spatial segregation happening. Pretty much everyone is fishing everywhere. And I think that's what is kind of exacerbating these conflicts. So I think just, reading the news and looking at the kinds of conflicts in the fisheries will tell you that clearly this is not a system that's, operating at its optimum best or in any sort of efficient way in the long term. And that will give you a clue as to what is happening underwater.
Yeah, thank you so much, Dr. Karnad. I think, just like you kind of said about highlighting these complexities, between artisanal fishing and also small scale fishing, all these different kind of levels is really important. So thank you so much for kind of giving us an idea about that as well. So just continuing with you, Dr. Karnad, how do you think different stakeholders influence the use of trawling in different landscapes, and what role do you think they kind of play in ecosystems such as this?
Yeah, so I think like Rohan was saying initially, that when trawling was first introduced, it was seen as this really efficient way of fishing, and it really brought in a lot of profits. It allowed fishermen to really tap into a global market, which is something that they hadn't done before. And therefore, it became very popular and something that everyone really wanted to do. The government also helped by providing various schemes and so on that allowed more fishers as well as other people to get into these kind of fisheries. But as time went on, there were clearly limits to how much could be taken out of the ocean, especially if it was not being taken out in a very selective way. So because it's so non-selective and practically everything in the path of the net was being taken out of the ocean, mostly they were not in a condition where you could, release them back alive into the ocean, even if you didn't use them. So in this situation, it eventually has not been able to maintain that kind of profitability. So right now, what you're seeing is that the people who are who have been in the trawl fishery for a while, there are people who are looking to get out, and there were talks for a while, at least in the state of Tamil Nadu, about creating policies or some kind of an incentive scheme to allow fishers to get out of the fisheries. Unfortunately, that has not come to pass, but that is something that people are considering, because it is just not as profitable as it was before, which is what is pushing people to try different things and different methods, and having multi-day trawls and 2 trawlers with 1 net and so on. But on the other side of it is what is happening in the small scale fisheries. So a lot of the small scale fisheries now are pretty much devastated by, many decades of trawling within nearshore areas. There just isn't that much fish anymore. And also with increasing climate change and other kinds of impacts, it's just not a sort of secure or regular income that people can get anymore. And so given those circumstances, people in the small scale are sort of looking at the trawl fishery as a kind of regular income, some kind of employment, something that they can bank on. And so they are seeing trawling as their way out of the uncertainties of small scale fishing. So there is still a draw factor where people want to get into this kind of fishing. Many of those schemes that the government put in place decades ago still exist. And so just by word of mouth or whatever, people still seem to want to get into it. But the people who are already in it are looking for a way out. So I think there's some sort of disconnect there, and some amount of awareness needs to be done with the small scale sector that this is perhaps not the best alternative. And I think that's where we kind of stand.
Thank you, Dr. Karnad. It's I think it's really interesting to kind of get an idea of these kind of complexities with people already being involved in it, and people that there is that draw factor that is trying to entice people to kind of get into it. So yeah, it's very interesting in that sense, for sure. So I also want to kind of talk about the species that are often found in bycatch. So Dr. Arthur, could you tell us a little bit about this and how trawling can influence species populations in the future?
So as both Jan and Divya have pointed out, through this discussion, we're finding that trawling itself is actually surprisingly complex, in both in the types of gears and things that are being used, the kinds of habitats that are being fished, as well as both as a social ecological system as well. Now, it seems like a simple question to answer, but actually it's quite difficult since what is a target and what is a bycatch depends, is quite, particularly within the Indian context, depends a lot on price, for instance. So the difference between a target species and a non-target species can actually change a lot from time to time, depending very much on the market pressure within the Indian context. So by and large, the target is, in Indian fisheries is prawns, squid, ribbonfish, breams, and occasional other species like pomfret or Bombay duck, etc., depending on the region. These tend to be the high value catches. And whatever else gets scooped up is considered to be bycatch. So each trawl haul could have a large amount of crabs and other crustaceans. It could have sardines, it could have sea louse, ponyfish, groupers as well, several other species of fish. These are not strictly targets, but they could still sometimes fetch a decent price. So they may be bycatch, but they will still be of some economic value. Whether they are maintained or not depends very much on the asking rate on that particular day. And fishers are making these dynamic, active decisions about whether to keep the catch or to discard them. And also there are local rules as well about that determine whether discards are allowed or not. In many regions, this motley melange of species is then painstakingly separated. If it is brought to the shore, it is painstakingly separated and then becomes part of the animal feed industry for poultry, or increasingly even to supplement things like aquaculture. So along with this regular fare, trawl fishing, of course, also lands up snaring nearshore dolphins, turtles, the occasional whale, and seabirds as well. And of course, these can cause huge demographic consequences for some of these species. The one species that we know of that it causes a huge amount of impacts on are things like turtles that aggregate to breed, and makes them particularly vulnerable to trawling. Okay, I wish I could tell you what the impacts of this bycatch removal was on the species populations of many of the species being caught in India. That its impacts are large, I'm pretty certain, but how large I actually wouldn't know. And the problem is that actually we don't have the kind of detailed population and ecosystem studies that we might need in the Indian context to figure this out. We don't really know that really. We actually need the kinds of studies that Jan has been doing, okay, within temperate waters. And in tropical waters, things get complicated by having hugely multi-species. The huge numbers of species within in a tropical system makes that significantly difficult, because apart from just population level effects, you're going to have a whole lot of multi-species kind of effects as well in terms of changing of species interactions, etc. And we just don't have those studies yet within the Indian context. So I think those kinds of studies need to be done. They need to be done quickly before these systems disappear altogether. Apart from the population level work, I really think we need more ecosystem level work as well. We barely have these, the entire 7,500 kilometers of the Indian coastline. We barely have the habitats themselves properly mapped. And yet we are trawling them and using them very intensively. So we barely know what 50 or 60 years of trawling has done to that coastline. And those are the kinds of things that we really need to be doing in the next couple of decades.
Thank you, Dr. Arthur. I think, yeah, like you've said, just highlighting that gap that's there in the research that we need to be doing is really important. So I think that's really insightful, and thank you for sharing that aspect of it as well. Dr. Hiddink, so could you tell us a little bit more about, the types of equipment that you mentioned, and maybe how these types of equipment also impact, can create the impacts we're seeing in the trawling activity?
Yes. So, yeah, as I mentioned before, there's different types of trawl gears that they use. So auto trawl, beam trawl, and scallop dredges are the most commonly used ones. So an auto trawl has got doors that keep the net open, and it means that the net can be really quite wide. So they can be between 10 meters and 150 meters wider. So beam trawls have got a beam that keeps the net open, and that limits how wide it can be. So they can be up to something like 60 meters in width or so, and they are often fished two at the same time. And scallop dredges are quite different, as in these are much more steel structures rather than nets, and they've got a range of teeth at the mouth of the net that dig into the sediment and then flick the scallops out of the sediment into a chainmail bag that retains the scallops. So just the different operation of these different gears already makes a difference for how it affects the different the benthic communities and the catches. What we found in our work was that the impact on seabed correlates very closely with the penetration depth of the gear into the sediment. So gears that penetrate more deeply will have a much larger effect than gears that are lighter and don't penetrate as much. So that gives us some way of managing these impacts as well, by trying to design fishing gears that are lighter, or for example, where particular components of the gear are not on the seabed. So with auto trawls, people have developed otter trawls where the actual otter doors, which are the heaviest parts, are lifted off the seabed and are therefore not creating furrows in the seabed. Then another important issue is, of course, the ship that's actually being used and how long the fishing trips are. So from what I know from India, is that most vessels probably do day trips from the harbor where they go out and then land their catch immediately again. In Northern Europe, most fishing actually occurs on much longer trips. There are much larger vessels that may have, so my guess is that the average size of a trawl vessel, well, what I know from that the average size of trawl vessels in Southeast Asia was something like 5 tons, or between 5 and 10 tons, while in Europe most fishing vessels are more around 300 tons in size. So they're much larger. They've got much bigger engines, and they often also have large holds in which they can store lots of ice. So that means that they can go on long trips much further away from their home port to go fishing. Well, and one other very important characteristics of different trawl gears is the actual mesh size that you fish with. So a lot of the problems that the other two panelists have described for the fishery in India relate to the fact that in many tropical areas where there's not strong management of the trawl fisheries, the fishers can use trawl gears with very small meshes. So meshes that are maybe 1 centimeter or 2 centimeters, which means that you catch basically lots of very small fish. And the reason why they end up in this situation is often because they may have started out with large mesh sizes, but if there's no limitation on the amount of fish that can be caught and be landed, you will always end up in a situation where you're depleting your fish stock. And therefore there's an incentive to fish with a smaller mesh size and therefore be able to continue catching fish even when the large fish are gone. In tropical ecosystem, you can also imagine that the productivity is much higher because the water is warmer, and therefore actually the production of small fish may actually also be much higher than in colder areas. In many fisheries that you get around here, around the UK, there are very strict limits on mesh sizes that you're allowed to use. So I think it's either 8 or 10 or 12 centimeter meshes that they have to use, and they can't use smaller mesh sizes, and they are checked regularly, and that means that you avoid catching lots of these small fish. And in some fisheries, they mostly catch, like for example around Iceland, they mostly catch fish that are between 0.5 meter and 1 meter in length or so. So they can catch very big fish. So there's a clear interaction between how the fishing is being done versus the amount of management of your fishery you've got. So yeah, it's very variable in the world, and it does strongly. Well, it's different between different ecosystems, but also strongly depends on the management regime. Thank you.
Thank you for the information, Dr. Hiddink. I think it's interesting to learn more about how the ships and mesh sizes being used are also aspects that are impacting benthic biodiversity. So I'd like to kind of go a little bit deeper and kind of delve into the impacts of trawling and how these can be managed. So for this question, I'd like to open the floor up to all the panelists. So kind of in your opinion, what are the challenges associated when we think about tackling trawling as a global issue? So Dr. Karnad, would you like to share your thoughts on this with us?
Sure. I think globally, we have recognized that at least bottom trawling or certain types of trawling are especially bad. And one of the ways in which it continues to operate is because there are governments who provide subsidies or schemes and things to promote these kinds of fisheries. In India, for instance, we definitely have subsidies for people who operate trawl vessels, and this is one of the reasons why it continues to be somewhat profitable. And I think if those kinds of things were removed, that would make a huge difference with respect to just the economics of trawling. And as a result, it might really shift the whole fishery towards a different direction. And not necessarily saying the different direction would be better or worse, but yeah.
Thank you for the insight, Dr. Karnad. Dr. Arthur, what do you think are some of the challenges associated with this?
So, I mean, I think scaling back a sector as large as trawling I don't think it's going to be easy. I think the professor, Jan might be able to tell us a little bit, from his experience in Europe, where they've actually been able to place limits on what's happening in the trawling sector. He might have a perspective that it might be quite different. But destructive as trawling is in much of the tropics, it still contributes very significantly to the immediate food security needs of countries like India. And it supports a huge livelihood sector. So scaling that back, I think, is going to be difficult. And I think Divya pointed out on one of the principal reasons why the sector is being propped up, and much of that is being propped up by by subsidies and things like that. Subsidies on fuel, subsidies on the boats themselves, etc. And each fisheries plan pours in more money into that. Now, of course, as Divya mentioned in an earlier response as well, that it's not really being very profitable. The profitability of the sector is reducing. And so one potential option is to just let the market economics just play itself out, and allow resource depletion and declining profitability to shift the commercial interests elsewhere. To some extent, as Divya was saying, it's already taking place in some parts of the coast. Many people who are part of the fishery want to get out of it because it's just not profitable at all. Within the Indian context, and this is true of other places as well, the governments are moving away from from capture fisheries more towards aquaculture, and mariculture kind of things as well. With the hope is that, of course, this could reduce pressure on the capture fisheries, although that's not completely certain, because it could potentially, even contribute much, much more to the forage fish and things like that. So that's not, I think, to rely just on market dynamics and would be actually quite disastrous. I think, one reason, of course, is that declining profitability of the sector is not really the reason why people move away from fisheries. Like most resource users, fishers are not driven by just sterile economic rationality, and they might continue to trawl until nearshore benthic ecosystems have been completely transformed, because it's not the overall overall profits but that drive people. It's much, much more complex when the decision making the fishers make is much, much more complex. The other thing, of course, the other problem is that while most fishing today is largely limited to continental shelves, benthic trawling is allowing fishers to go deeper where midwater pelagic trawling is allowed. Okay, and they're going much further away beyond the 200 nautical miles. And of course, beyond the 200 nautical miles of the exclusive economic zone, it is largely a free-for-all. And in those areas, controlling large industrial scale fishing, it's very, very, very difficult. You have the UN Law of the Sea, and there are a few other conventions that regulate this. What happens beyond national boundaries is actually quite difficult. And I think one of the primary challenges to bringing many of these industrial scale fisheries under check is that governments need to cooperate in trying to put these laws in place. I think perhaps the biggest challenge at a regional level is changing government mindsets. The fact that governments need to believe, first of all, in declining catches, I think is critical. before they are going to do anything about it. And this needs to be accepted at policy level. As long as capture fisheries are still seen as some kind of an unlimited bounty, kind of cornucopia that continues to give, I don't think that there will be much support for any efforts to reduce the fishery. Within the Indian context, the fisheries does not contribute more than a few percentage points to the overall GDP. But the idea still is that all you need to do is to try harder and go deeper and go further in order to make it contribute much more. And I think that is highly misplaced. And I think that unless that you have that policy shift, a paradigm shift in the way you look at the fishery itself, the shift is not going to happen. And I think that we really need this narrative shift needs to take place towards a clearer understanding of the ecological limits of these nearshore ecosystems. And once that narrative shift takes place, we will go a long way in formulating regulations for trawling. This is within the context of tropical fisheries. In Europe, I think they've gone much, much further in trying to understand those limits and scaling back those trawlers. And perhaps Jan may be able to tell you a lot more from his experience.
Yes, thank you for highlighting, the governmental complexities and, the policy level aspects as well, Dr. Arthur. Even in terms of an Indian context, I think this is really important. Dr. Hiddink, could you share your insights with us?
Yeah, to me, the main problems tend to be about overfishing. So where there is more fishing than what the ecosystem can actually support, which is very much related to what Dr. Arthur was talking about. So the amount of fish that you can produce tends to peak at intermediate levels of effort. If you then fish more, you have to put in more effort, you're catching less fish, and you're doing more damage to the seabed ecosystem. But to manage this fishery in a way where you're actually getting a maximum yield, while also which tends to coincide with fairly low ecosystem impacts, requires strong governance. And even in Europe, that has taken a very long time to get to that stage. So only in the last 15 years or so has effort in northwestern Europe dropped to a level where most fish stocks are now exploited at maximum sustainable yield. In the Mediterranean, most fish stocks are still overfished. So the reason why we get in this situation is that there tends to be a continuous creep in effort where each individual fishing boat is trying to maximize their catches, and that makes it difficult. But to drop that effort, to increase your yield, would mean that in the short term your catches are going to drop, even though in the long term they're going to be higher. So it involves short-term economic and political pain, even if in the long term it would be beneficial. And that's why it's so difficult to make this transition. If you don't have strong political will and strong management systems that can actually enforce these kind of measures. Because in Europe there have always been big problems, for example, with illegal fishing as well, where people were trying to avoid the fishing quotas that had been set. What seems to be happening now, actually, for example, in the North Sea, where there's lots of fishing, is that because the fuel for the vessels has become so expensive, some fishing vessels can't actually economically continue trawling, just because they catch about 1 ton of fish for every 2 tons of fuel they burn. So therefore, if the fuel price goes up, the fish price is just not high enough to be able to support that. So that's another reason why fishing effort has actually been dropping quite a bit in the last 5 years or so over here, which is good for the fishes that continue fishing and tends to be good for the fish stocks and the wider environment. But maybe not so good for for the people that lose their jobs. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Hiddink. Just even to discuss the political complexities as well, that's definitely an aspect I think we need to factor in when we think of trawling activity on a global scale. So I think we have time for one more question before we start taking questions from the audience. And so I'd like to address this question as well to all of our panelists. So what policies, disciplines, and concepts do you think we should be engaging with in order to help mitigate the impacts of trawling? So Dr. Arthur, would you like to share your thoughts with us?
As I've been saying, that despite being destructive in the extreme, trawling still contributes to more than 50% of the catch in India. And stopping it, I think, would be a pipe dream. Not sure if it would be completely desirable, in at least in the short term. And I think, perhaps at the policy level, the most meaningful thing to do would be to reduce and finally stop issuing more trawling licenses. Most of the evidence shows that the sector is already functioning beyond capacity. So it would make very little sense to add to it right now. That's one thing. What we urgently need is much more basic ecological studies to focus on species populations and ecosystem functioning along the coast. We still don't know in the tropical context whether we can use things like maximum sustainable yield and those kind of models, particularly when we are dealing with so many species that are being targeted, and whether those kind of the models that have been so successful in the temperates to regulate the fishery, I'm not sure they will be as successful in countries like India in the tropical context. But we do need, therefore, more basic ecological studies on population dynamics and how they are being influenced by offtake. If we can then come up with some kind of models that make sense, that are actually not just that make sense, that are implementable within the Indian context, given what we have in terms of our, the infrastructure of monitoring. That's absolutely critical. At present, the Indian fisheries policy engages in a rather patchy way, with fishery science. And part of that, of course, is the unwillingness of the policy makers to listen to warnings from ecologists when ecologists keep saying that it's overfished and that we need to reduce the fishery, etc. But a large part of it is also that the science itself is inadequate and patchy, giving policymakers actually very little to work with in India. For a start, we don't basically know where the population boundaries are for even the most commonly caught species along the coast. So doing any kind of stock assessment that can inform management makes actually very little sense. On top of that, we have every state within India managing their fishery on their own, creating their own rules in terms of mesh sizes, in terms of what can be caught, in terms of whether certain types of trawling are allowed or not. And they have no forms of integration of knowledge between states, no coordination at all. So we talked about different countries coordinating their efforts, but within India, within the states themselves need to coordinate those efforts, and that hasn't happened yet. So on the one hand, we really need the restructuring of that of the way fisheries policy takes place. We also need much more information on, trying to understand basic life histories of target species, understanding reproductive periods to find out critical spawning grounds, for instance. Because if we have to establish, for instance, relevant fishing holidays, they need to overlap with the breeding periods or locations of those, for species. On another level, and I think Divya would probably, resonate with this, I think we need much better information on the community of trawl fishers themselves. I think understanding their motivations and their needs is quite critical. The solution space should certainly come from the stakeholders who seek to gain most. And I think no conversation about the fishery should take place without trawl fishers squarely in the middle of that. So that's, broad ideas of what I could say. Divya?
I don't know how much more I can add to this, but yeah, I think the important thing, like Rohan was saying, is to figure out who exactly is doing the fishing and what it means to them. Because like Rohan was saying before, when you are thinking about alternatives or trying to kind of reduce one sector like the trawl sector and so on, it really matters, what you are going to provide to these people as alternatives. If they identify as fishers, it really doesn't make sense to then sort of shunt them into construction or, some kind of irrelevant profession, because they have all this knowledge, they have all this experience, and this, really wealth of experience and knowledge that we can also really benefit from. And we do, at least in my work, I really benefit from all this knowledge that these people have. And it really wouldn't make sense to provide them alternatives that they don't identify with and that they feel that they will not be able to do. But the other thing is also about who you have to engage with to actually make these changes, because there are the people who are doing the fishing in the water, and then often there are a totally different set of people who own the boats. And unless you can engage with both these sets of people and come up with some kind of a policy that will benefit both these sets of people, it really doesn't make sense. So to just give you an example, for instance, in southern Tamil Nadu, when the farming sector failed in the interiors, a lot of the farmers moved into the fisheries, and particularly moved into trawling. And so to now talk about how you reduce capacity in the trawling, you really have to look at what's happening in the interiors within the farming sector. So these solutions are not, contained within the fisheries themselves, but require larger conversations that we need to have about the economy as a whole, and what is failing and what is driving people into different things. So this is one of the things that I wanted to point out. And also this idea of, the blue economy and the new sort of blue revolution that our government is now talking about. The idea for a blue economy originally came up as a sort of sustainable development idea. But the way that it's being spoken about in the Indian context, I think the sustainable part has sort of been forgotten. And certainly the development part is what is being pushed. And I think within this sort of push, we need to have larger spaces to engage. There needs to be more conversation happening both with fishers and with ecologists or conservationists, because there's no way that you can really have some kind of development which is not going to benefit the masses who are going to lose their livelihoods if we don't have any sort of change within the fishery sector.
Thank you, Dr. Karnad. Yeah, I think it's really interesting just to think about, all these different aspects in an Indian context and also in a global aspect. So thank you for that. Professor Hiddink, could you share your thoughts with us as well, please?
Well, the previous two panelists have already made the important points that it is really about managing the people that are working in these these industries. The one other thing that I'd like to mention is that you may want to consider creation of marine protected areas. If you can identify that there's areas that are particularly sensitive to trawling impacts because they've got special species in them, then it may be worthwhile to try and create areas that are close to fishing there. But again, it's going to depend on whether the governance and management systems are in place to be able to enforce these places, because there's no point in creating areas to protect habitats from trawling if you can't actually enforce these kind of structures. And that then comes back to many of the problems that have been mentioned before. You need to engage the the fishing community if you want to have success in achieving any of these conservation measures. So I'll keep it to that.
Thank you, Dr. Hiddink, and thank you to all our panelists. It's been a really engaging discussion. We'll now take questions from the audience who've sent them in to us. And we've actually received a question regarding kind of domestic aspects. So I'd like to address this to Dr. Karnad. Are the fish caught being exported or consumed domestically?
I mean, I think there is a mix of both. Certainly, the aim of the trawl industry is to export, but a lot of the fish that we eat domestically is also coming from trawl fisheries. And the small scale sector doesn't really play a very big role other than just the extreme coastal strip. Of course, there is the whole aquaculture sector as well, which is now vastly overtaken all seafood supplies, whether domestic or exports. And I think that's something that's that we definitely have to keep an eye on, because it, like Rohan said, it has very close linkages with what's happening out there in our oceans.
Thank you, Dr. Karnad. So we've also received another question. I'd like to address this to Dr. Hiddink. How does variation in mesh sizes of trawling machines affect fish species?
Well, if you've got smaller mesh size, you'll catch smaller fish. Given that different species of fish grow to different sizes, if you're consistently fishing with small mesh sizes, then the larger fish species will never reach a size where they can actually reproduce. So then the larger fish species will go extinct. And yeah, you're just going to be left with lots of little fish. So yeah, which may actually in some situations may result in a higher total fish production, because smaller fish tends to grow faster, but it's obviously resulting in quite a depauperate ecosystem.
Thank you, Dr. Hiddink.
Just to add to that, if I could, Jan, you mentioned, I'm not sure what kind of mesh sizes you talked about that are being used in Europe, but along the west coast of India, for instance, the average mesh sizes are between 20 to 35 millimeters. Again, that varies considerably from state to state. And so while some states might have lots of variation on the kinds of mesh sizes allowed, much of the mesh size is actually based on shrimp, on very, very small shrimp. And everything else is caught along with that. So 20 millimeters is I think, some of the minimums that are being allowed. I don't know how that compares with the European situation.
Well, most fisheries will have a mesh size of somewhere around 10 centimeters or so, but we do actually have some very coastal fisheries for very small shrimps that don't grow large, they use those kind of mesh sizes as well. But yeah, they're only used in very specific locations where those shrimps are abundant. So it's not normal to use those kind of tiny mesh sizes.
Can I ask a follow-up question?
Yes, sure. Please go ahead.
So this is something that I've been thinking about for a while, and I think Dr. Hiddink, perhaps you can answer it. If there are many species that are selected in that the juveniles or the young life stages are expecting a lot of predation, so for those species, wouldn't it be better to catch juveniles?
And so it depends on what you're trying to achieve. If you just want to maximize the amount of food that you're producing, it may be the rational choice to fish really hard with quite small mesh sizes and to maximize the production of those small species of fish. It will result, though, in a situation where all your larger fish species will disappear, and you'll have quite strong impacts on the rest of the ecosystem. So it's about a trade-off about what society desires to maximize fish production of particular species that may also not be the most popular fish to eat, versus potentially having a more intact ecosystem with potentially larger species that may be a bit higher value. But this situation is probably quite different for tropical waters versus temperate waters, where we don't have so many species that mature at very small sizes, and also we tend to just discard any of those small species rather than land them and use them for anything.
Thank you, Dr. Hiddink. Thank you. We have time, I think, for one last question. So I'd like to address this to Dr. Arthur. Is there any other alternative method that could be practical for small fishing communities? And how likely is it that trawling industries might change some of their methods?
I'm not completely certain I understand where that question is going. Perhaps if the person who asked the question can try to clarify, that will be, I think that I'd be better able to answer.
Okay, sure. So I think that in the context of essentially just trying to understand for small fishing communities what kind of other opportunities they might have in terms of kind of alternate livelihoods and things like that, that's kind of what the question was.
I think, I think that in terms of, I think Divya suggested a part of the response in she, when responding to an earlier question, she said that, I think that we really need to think carefully about fishers as a community which have a very distinct identity. And while it has been very popular within the Indian context to consider alternate livelihoods as a way to get people out of the fishery, I'm not certain that it can work across the board, because people, the identity of a fisherman is a very particular one, and I think that what we need to look at is how people, you don't want to create a community of people who are completely disembedded from the ecosystem. I think much of the solution space lies within within the fishing community itself, and for them to be able to create their own limits. Now, of course, the one thing that I've been trying to grapple with is whether traditional institutions can actually work to manage these, manage fisheries slightly better, to regulate their own catches. One simple way is the way that is done in much of Europe, which is you have strong top-down control with a huge amount of management, with a large the infrastructural capacity for monitoring and for sanctioning that works really well, along with proper monitoring of catches, etc., etc. That kind of management system may not work for the kind of coastlines we have, for the kinds of infrastructure and monitoring we have. The alternative, of course, is to work from the bottom up and to work with local institutions doing things at a local level. But I suspect that that's actually going to be difficult as well. And probably Divya, who's worked with some of these communities, may be able to tell us whether this is true. Traditional institutions, I think, typically work for small scale fishing done at human scales. And the thing about mechanized fishing is that it's much larger, I think, than the ability of many small communities, at least, to make sense of. And I think that I could be completely wrong here. I'm going out on a limb to say that our ability as a community to make sense of how ecosystems functions becomes, I think, rapidly inaccurate as the systems we're harvesting grows beyond the human scale. So I'm not sure how local knowledge can translate to these regulative institutions, where the links between your activity and the trends on the fish in the fishery are not completely clear. So, when it comes to things like coastal fisheries, etc., in small coastal fisheries or in coral reefs, your own overfishing is feeds back really quickly to local communities. And therefore people can make adaptive rules about what to do, etc. When it comes to trawling, I'm not completely certain that's that is possible. One potential way, I think, is revitalizing local cooperatives, but I'm not sure, Divya, do you think that is one way that a bottom-up kind of management of the fishery could take place?
Yeah, so I would definitely agree that a completely top-down approach probably will not work in conditions like India, and that we have this long history of traditional customary fisheries management at local scales, especially within the small scale sector. But having said that, I found evidence, for instance, of these kinds of institutions existing within the so-called small-scale trawl sector, the single-day trawls. And so they are also capable of seeing these kind of feedback, or getting this kind of feedback information about the impacts of their fisheries. And this is particularly true of the kinds of trawlers that employ locally, where everyone involved is or has been into fishing for multiple generations or over a period of time. And also the economic structures are different, where it sort of resembles a small scale fishery in terms of the kinds of relationships between the fishermen involved. And also in terms of not being like a multi-day, really large scale operation. So in those cases, you do see some kinds of measures being taken towards preventing completely destructive impacts on the ecosystem. And certainly it seems like a model that can work at the local scale. Where they face a problem is when they encounter, let's call them the roving bandits from other states or other locations, where they really don't know how to handle. I mean, if things are happening locally, I think they can handle those kinds of problems. But if things are happening beyond a particular scale of their influence, I don't think they can handle those kinds of situations. Which is why it has been suggested by many social scientists who've studied the fisheries that this sort of really needs to work within a nested system where the government can come in and support these local institutions rather than kind of trying to kill them, where they can, really amplify the effect that these local institutions are having over larger scales. So they're sort of talking about co-management in some ways, but sort of driven by the grassroots rather than a sort of top-down driven co-management.
That makes a lot of sense.
Thank you so much, Dr. Karnad, and thank you, Dr. Arthur. So as we're running out of time, we'll have to conclude our webinar. I'd like to take this opportunity to thank our esteemed panelists. Dr. Arthur from NCF can be reached through his researcher profile on ncfindia.org. Dr. Hiddink can be reached on his portal at research.bangor.ac.uk, and Dr. Karnad can be reached via her portal on ashoka.edu.in. So thank you very much to all our panelists for adding great insight to our discussion today and taking the time out to participate in an exciting discussion. Alternatively, the audience can get in touch with us and we'd be happy to also connect you with the panelists. So I hope all of you in the audience enjoyed our CWS Wildlife Chronicles webinar. To know more about us or get involved in our organization, you can write to us at outreach@cwsindia.org. So wishing all our viewers and our panelists a happy Republic Day. Thank you once again, and we'll see you at our next CWS Wildlife Chronicles webinar.